Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to this week's Digital Law News, brought to you by Digital Law and produced by Anson Evaluate. So just for those who don't know, Digital Law is a small law firm based in the UK, which specialises in digital and technology matters such as data protection and international data transfers. So I'm joined with my colleague Peter today, so I'll just pass over to him to give you a little bit of an introduction.
Thanks, Laura. Yes, great to be back for this week's update. Yeah, we'll be looking at key news stories that are in the news this week from a tech perspective, and trying to give you a different take on some of the insights from a technology and law perspective.
Great, so we'll get straight started. So the first one is regarding Uber and the fact that the Transport for London are having some issues over whether they're going to renew their licence again. So Uber have actually found to be giving information to the police. So the police are now saying that they are in favour of Uber keeping their licence, as the National Police Chiefs Council have actually claimed that its ability to tackle drug dealing, human trafficking and child sexual exploitation would be hindered if they actually lost this outlook of their way into receiving this information. However, the Transport for London did actually refuse to renew Uber's licence back in November of last year after safety failures. So the magistrates must now decide whether Uber is fit and proper operator, and whether their licence will actually be renewed or not.
Thanks, Laura. It's a very interesting story because there have been issues with Uber in terms of the information that it collects in the past. It lost its licence a few years ago because of issues that a lot of the other cab operators were quite against the idea of Uber operating in London, and it was seen that that was one of the reasons why they lost their license a few years ago. But on this instance, it's interesting that the National Police Chiefs have identified the fact that, look, we actually get an awful lot of very helpful information here from Uber. Now, I'd say there's two things to think about here. First of all, under GDPR Article 6, it is possible for Uber to be compelled to provide personal data to law enforcement in certain circumstances, where it's sort of very much in the public interest and where there is a public order issue. But this would suggest that this is actually happening on a fairly broad brush basis. I mean, it's possible to imagine if you've got to say a police incident where they end up identifying that things of the nature they're identifying there, like drug dealing, human trafficking and child exploitation. If you've got an incident and then you want to work out, well, how did these people get here? Where were they collected? Was anyone else dropped off on the way? How was the Uber ordered? What account was debited for that Uber to operate? You can suddenly see the rich nature of the data that these organisations, that the police would then be able to benefit from in terms of getting this from Uber, and it would aid their investigation. But clearly this is happening on a fairly wide basis. I mean, we know that things like human trafficking, modern slavery, things like that are a real issue across the country, but particularly in London and the southeast. And you can imagine that therefore the National Police Chiefs don't particularly want to lose access to that data. But this does flag up the fact that certainly significant data is probably being handed over, and we don't tend to think, I think, when we're using Uber and other apps, anything from say Airbnb to Netflix and things, we don't tend to think about the fact that all of that operation generates personal data and can end up being accessed and used. So this is clearly assisting the police, and actually you think, yeah, they're probably getting much more data from Uber than they could hope to get from a traditional cab company who simply couldn't provide you with the sort of rich level of data that Uber can.
Yeah, because I suppose a lot of cabs that you use on a daily basis wouldn't collect the data because they'd only have, say, your phone number, and then you usually pay by cash. So it is good in the way that Uber do collect that personal data, and it is stored on the person's account. So there's always a record of it. So it would be a shame for the police to lose out on that data if it is making such significant effects.
Exactly, and in many instances, of course, if it's a traditional London black cab, then if that was just hailed to the curbside by the passenger, they wouldn't even have the phone number that you might have got from a booking or an email address from an online booking. So the amount of data that could be used would be very, very poor. Whereas in this instance, you've got a very, very potential source of very rich data that can be used. But the fact that this is probably a level of bulk data surveillance that hasn't really been considered previously makes us really have cause for concern. Well, of course, pause for thought, I suppose, with regards to the fact that virtually every activity we undertake now means that data is being gathered and in certain circumstances can be passed over to law enforcement. So just shows the lengths now that law enforcement will go to try and get the information that they need in order to successfully secure convictions.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to the next story. So this one is from the NCSC. So the NCSC have actually issued an alert after a recent spike in attacks on educational institutions. So these have been predominantly ransomware incidents which actually block access to the computer systems. And as we all know, we've mentioned ransomware before in these short podcasts and webinars, that they actually block the access and you have to pay a ransom in order to get the access back. However, you could restore the systems from your backup. So now they're saying that these attacks are happening and they could derail their preparations for new terms, which obviously could have an effect on the students who go there. So the three that are predominantly most spoken about was the Newcastle University attack, the one on Northumbria University, which were both this month, and the Leeds College Group, which was last month. So NCSC is now urging all institutions to read the newly updated guidance on mitigating malware and ransomware attacks, which we actually spoke about, I think it was in last week's webinar, and to develop an incident response plan, which they are regular testing as well.
Indeed, this is quite a timely story. I mean, this is a news update, of course, but the fact that, of course, all the universities are trying to head back to term, to start new terms. Many of them are operating either a remote working or a hybrid model, with students doing a lot of their lecture work remotely and then perhaps just going along to the occasional seminar group with social distancing being in place. And so these universities are relying on their networks even more than would ordinarily be the case. I think it's a worry as well when you've got universities that lead a lot of the cutting edge research that the UK is known for. We tend to invent a lot of things and sort of develop a lot of things, even if we don't end up sort of perfecting them and having the big corporations afterwards to end up successfully perfecting and marketing them. But we do this huge amount of research in the UK, and therefore if our networks are being targeted and taken down, or are vulnerable to exploitation by things like ransomware, that should be a massive concern to law enforcement and the National Cybersecurity Centre as a whole. And in this instance, where it could have a big impact on the studies that students are trying to now undertake remotely, it's a major barrier to trying to get the universities and students back to being able to have something close to a traditional academic experience when it's proving difficult to be able to rely on these systems. Interestingly, the NCSC has produced guidance on ransomware recently, saying that one thing to be careful of is that the hackers very often now are going in, actually accessing and copying the data before then locking it, encrypting it and ransoming it. So they're then able to, not only are they charging the ransom, they're then potentially still able to go ahead and use and exploit the data that they've accessed anyway. So it's those sort of twin threats. And when we're talking about academic data here being used for that, it really is a massive cause for concern. So as the NCSC quite rightly says, do need to think about having an incident response plan, making sure it works, make sure it's quick, test it. And then even the NCSC even has a exercise in a box exercise on their website, which encourages organizations to think about what would you do if you were hacked, how would you respond, how would you get all those measures in place. So Really, it's a matter of sort of following through with that and actually making sure that these universities have good response plans in place and that they are tested regularly.
Yeah, and reading more into this as well, it was saying that students were posing some other risks as well by getting into through to the systems, maybe via the students' accounts and things like that, from having poor passwords and everything. So I think it is just passing that information on to everybody, not just those in the organisation, but the students as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right, Laura, and it comes down to always that issue of training and actually making sure that the universities have taken the time, even with their new students, even with their new intake who have only started in the last few days. You know, really universities need to be thinking about when you're doing the onboarding process for those students, part of that needs to be thinking about cyber security, cyber hygiene, so that they aren't using poor passwords, that they aren't daisy chaining passwords, and for example, that they're being careful with the mobile devices that they use as well, because all of these issues can create vulnerabilities, and that's where the hackers are then exploiting them.
Yeah, definitely. So moving on to the next one. So this is one we've spoke about in the past, probably since we started these weekly news updates, but this is regarding data protection and considerations in terms of the NHS COVID-19 app, so the test and trace. So we did speak about a couple of weeks ago, maybe months ago, that the ICO did have some concerns over the DPIA and, well, the lack of the DPIA at the time, and their plans for the app. However, the government have now made some changes to the app based on the ICO's feedback. So this is things to do with giving clear information regarding automatic decision making, providing further transparency for individuals on how and when their personal data is considered anonymous and who is it shared with, creating greater clarity of data flows and security considerations, and things to do with data subjects' rights as well.
Indeed, the NHS app will be going live in the next couple of weeks. I think it's interesting that it's taken this long for the app to come back. I think in an ideal world, they would have had this app up and running probably from the early summer onwards, because clearly as there's now a spike in cases in England and Wales and Scotland, I think ideally they would have been able to keep a better position to be able to track and trace those who would come into contact with those who are infected if this app had been up and running sooner. But Laura, you and I have looked through the privacy impact assessment that was put together by the Department of Health on this, and it wasn't a document that really inspired us with confidence, I think it's fair to say. It felt very rushed, it felt very hurried, and I think that speaks to the process that's been followed with this app. It felt like whoever had drafted it had just received information in response to questions sent out to the developers, and rather than sort of going carefully through and working through the headings that you'd expect to see in a privacy impact assessment, all of this information was just sort of pulled together and then thrown at the wall to just hope that somewhere, somehow, all of the vast amount of information that they gave would actually sort of tick all the necessary boxes you'd expect in a typical privacy impact assessment, which in fairness, it kind of did. It was just the fact that you could tell it had been done at speed. Now, if this app was being launched and we were having this discussion in April or May, and it had been done at tremendous speed, I would be, I think, okay, that's absolutely fine. They've done this at short notice. At least they've done the privacy impact assessment. At least the app's up and running. Hopefully this will now help people. But this is 6 months in now. You know, I mean, that really should have been time you would have expected for a proper, thorough privacy impact assessment to be put together by hopefully someone who knew what a typical privacy impact assessment looked like, and they would have at least have looked at the code of conduct on the ICO's own website, or even the tool, Laura, that you and I have used on the French Data Protection Officer, the CNIL website. Yet there was none of that, so I can't really say it's given me a huge amount of confidence when it comes to this app, but certainly it looks like they've hopefully improved the way that it handles personal data and with better information with regards to privacy. But I think we're going to have to now see how this app operates in practice, given that, of course, from the moment it's launched, I would expect that millions of people will want to download it and have it on their phones.
Yeah, definitely, because like you said, I feel like it'd be very interesting when the app does get released and you can download it to then actually check whether these things that they're now explaining, like the data protection things that they're putting in place and the security measures they're putting in place for the data that it's going to collect, whether they actually are in it or whether they're just trying to say it to build consumer confidence.
Yeah, and I'm going to be interested to see as well, because I believe that the app we're talking about here is going to, there's like an NHS England COVID app and an NHS Wales COVID app. Now, I know people who live in England and work in Wales and vice versa. So does that mean they've got to have two apps on their phone? And if so, does the app have the problems that were identified earlier in the year, where they were worried because the Bluetooth tracking was always on and it was constantly sending out signals on Bluetooth to connect to other people's devices, or at least work out where they were? Does that mean that people's phones will end up emptying their battery twice as fast if you've got two versions of this app on it? So, you know, now we've got to see. I think we can't afford to wait any longer for this app. Ideally, it would have been around earlier. We've got it now. Now we've just got to see, problems and all, whether it actually helps with the government's test and trace program. I hope it does.
Yeah, me too. I hope it is really successful, because it will be a great help in terms of keeping it under check before it does get a lot worse how they are expecting.
I think you're right. At the moment, we need all the help we can get. So let's hope that problems and everything, it does actually help to stem the tide a little bit.
Yeah. So moving on to the next one. So this is still in relation to coronavirus and the guidance that's being released at the moment. So last week, I think it was on Friday the 18th of September, government confirmed that it is now essential for all types, a majority of businesses to actually collect personal data from their customers and visitors. So this includes those in hospitality, leisure, beauty, and some other businesses who work in close contact to each other. So the ICO are now advising that the organisations actually follow 5 simple steps so they can handle people's personal data responsibly. So these are to only ask what the information that has been given by the government guidance, so don't collect on any unnecessary information, be clear, open, honest with people whose data you are collecting, keep the data secure, don't collect data for other purposes, and make sure that data is erased or disposed of correctly and securely within after the 21 days. So don't keep it for no longer than 21 days.
Indeed, 5 important steps, but I think it's proving to be a bit of a challenge for organisations to follow these measures. There's a story in the Times today about the fact that I think some cafes and bars are either not collecting data or they're not collecting enough data. I think some organisations have had like apps that they've used to allow people to book tables and then to order food and drinks, and in some instances those apps have then crashed, and you've had wait staff resorting to just walking around with notepads, and they've not been kept particularly secure. There has been a number of stories now of, regrettably, bar staff misusing the data that they've received. So you know, you suddenly start finding that the person who served you the drink earlier in the evening is then texting you, and you're like, well, where did you get this number from? Did you get it from track and trace? And then suddenly they're trying to say, oh, no, I didn't. Well, you clearly did. And that's an abuse of the data. You're only supposed to use the data for the purpose for which it's intended, and that is to provide to the government in case of a positive COVID-19 test by the customer or the bar staff, not for more casual purposes, which the bar staff appear to be trying to use that for. So this is happening too much, and I think the ICO has their concerns, which is why they've issued these 5 hopefully simple steps. But I think sometimes I actually wonder if the language is sufficiently clear. You know, when we're saying keep data secure, you know, I mean, Laura, you and I are engaged in working on data protection every day, but I sometimes wonder if the use of that word secure has certain connotations to people who work in the industry in terms of what that means. But I'm thinking, do those who run the cafes and bars necessarily get the importance of secure, which means it's not in a notepad that's left on a table somewhere. It's not just floating around in a back office. It is properly secure. Not to mention then the fact that the deletion of data after 21 days, you know, who's actually going through and deleting their records automatically after 21 days? I'd be interested to know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, like you said, I think the whole thing just needs a bit more clarity. Most people would understand if people do have knowledge of IT and how to delete things and how to keep like documents secure on their computers, maybe password encrypt things and just apply encryption to the server, etc. But a lot of people don't know how to do that, and it might be small family-run businesses who just don't really know. And although the people are trying to help, give them guidance on this, it does need to be clarified a little bit more, like you said.
Exactly. And I think it's a matter of, I sometimes wonder if the ICO are a better place sometimes, at the same time as saying, here are the 5 things, actually giving a few examples of what that means, what that good practice looks like in reality. But hopefully these 5, of course, the more you add that in, the more those 5 simple steps might become even more confusing, who knows. But let's hope that these 5 steps, let's see if they're successful, and let's see how organizations get on with following them.
Yeah, definitely. So this is the last story for today. So this is regarding the UK, and they condemns the Chinese cyber attacks against the governments and businesses. So the UK has today, whenever this article was actually written, within the last couple of days, joined the international allies to call out malicious cyber activity carried out by China. So criminal charges are against Chinese nationals, and arrests of Malaysian nationals have been announced by the US Department of Justice, following a campaign of attacks targeting governments and businesses. So the Foreign Secretary, Dominic Raab, actually commented on this and said that today we have another example of the Chinese using malicious cyber activity for criminal ends. We condemn the attempted attacks against governments and businesses. This kind of opportunist and reckless behaviour in cyberspace is wholly unacceptable.
Indeed. I think this ties into a lot of the stories we've seen over the last few months, Laura, where it's been looking at things like the change in approach from Western governments as a whole to China since the COVID virus has become a global pandemic. So we've had, for example, the UK government deciding to strip out Huawei equipment from its 5G network. We've had similar punitive action against Huawei taken by the US government, which has led on that. We've then had the US government making allegations with regards to TikTok, saying that it is potentially collecting Chinese data, collecting personal data and passing it to the Chinese state. And there's also been action taken against WeChat, the Chinese social network and sharing site. And this kind of fits into that by saying that there are bad actors out there here, and individuals have been charged in China. Chinese nationals have been arrested, and this is again on the back of a US-led Department of Justice campaign, where they're saying that there have been cyber attacks against governments and businesses. The wording, I think, is quite careful in this article to suggest it is perhaps individuals and looking at criminal ends. Doesn't necessarily say it is the Chinese state, but the line is clearly very, very narrow, and there is a certain amount of insinuation being made in between the lines. And this remains an issue. We know that there have always been concerns with regards to, for example, IP being acquired and used by China for nefarious ends from the West. And there have then been these other issues as well. And this kind of fits into that by saying that there is malicious activity from within Chinese actors when it comes to backing these sorts of threats. And given, I mean, we've talked already in this webinar today about the dangers to academia from ransomware attacks. And where do a lot of those automated ransomware attacks come from? That would be, unfortunately, very often from within China. So it's kind of just tying into that whole narrative. And it's interesting that the British Foreign Secretary has made these comments. And it's interesting that it is the UK's UK arm of the UK's signals post, GCHQ. It's like the civilian arm, NCSC, that is carrying this update and making it quite clear where their position is with regards to these threats.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so that's everything we've got time for today. So thank you again for listening. And just a reminder that we do have a special offer on still on our GDPR compliance manual for legal practices. So this was initially released in 2018, just before the GDPR came into force. It was originally priced at £195. However, this is now on sale for £99, which is around a 50% discount. And it is available in a hard copy and digital copy as well, just for an extra £5 for postage and packaging. So I'll just pass it over to you, Peter, to give a little bit of a description about it.
Yep, so the approach to GDPR compliance can often be quite overwhelming, I think, for a lot of organizations. So in this guide, it provides things like forms and templates and checklists to help you get a handle on the things that you can do to be able to demonstrate compliance and record the actions that you are taking, so that then, you know, the old adage of hope for the best, plan for the worst, it then means that you're compiling the evidence in the things that you do, so that if the worst happened, you could provide evidence to the regulator to say we were doing all we could be reasonably expected to do to demonstrate compliance with GDPR. And this guide gives you the forms, the infrastructure, and the documentation to get you on that path to working in that effective way.
Great. So thank you again for listening. This will be available on demand through our YouTube channel, our website, and on podcast channels as well. So we will be back next week on Tuesday at 4 o'clock. Thank you for listening.